And so it'll be led by Tom Standage, who's currently the deputy editor and head of digital strategy at The Economist. He joined The Economist actually in 1998 as a science correspondent and was subsequently appointed as technology editor, business editor, and digital editor. He's also written 6 history books, including a New York Times bestseller. And he'll be speaking with Dr. Simon Stringer, who is the director for the Oxford Center for Theoretical Neuroscience and AI, whose goal is really to develop integrated models of the brain that display rudimentary elements of artificial intelligence within 20 years. And he's been a 25-year-long research mathematician, has worked in a load of different areas, applying mathematics to control systems, computational aerodynamics, and epidemiology. So with that, please, Simon and Tom. Who's over there?
There he is. Hi, Tom. See. You might want to equip yourself with water first. We're going to talk about, essentially, we're going to cover this subject by talking about the boundary between neuroscience and AI. And there are lots of people working on that boundary, but Professor Stringer is a very good example of how there is an increasing amount of two-way traffic over this boundary and the advantages on both sides of it. But I think the place to start is probably, we've heard this morning, and we hear generally in all sort of coverage of AI and deep learning about the wonders of deep learning, how it's this incredibly versatile tool, it's incredibly powerful, you can use it in all sorts of different areas. You have a you look at all this coverage and you look at all this oohing and ahhing, and you have a rather different take on it, don't you? So why don't we start there? What's your different take on it?
So first of all, I wouldn't want to take away from any of the work on deep learning, but my lab at Oxford, what we're focused on is actually the operation of the brain, the operation of the cortex. And of course, deep learning architectures were originally inspired to some extent by brain architecture. But when you look at the architecture of the brain, it's actually very different to today's deep learning architecture. So what is going on in the brain that isn't happening in these artificial networks? So when you look at the brain, first of all, real neurons, they communicate by emitting electrical pulses called action potentials. Could that be important to the emergent dynamics? Secondly, the way that connections between cells are modified have been found to be critically dependent on the timings of those electrical pulses. And theoreticians wonder, is this important? There are other differences. When you look at the visual cortex, you not only see feed-forward processing, you see very extensive top-down connections and lateral connections. What are they doing there? People have thought maybe they're involved in attentional mechanisms. I never thought that. I thought there's something deeper going on here. On top of that, there are what we call axonal transmission delays between cells. So it takes time for an impulse to travel from one cell to another. Could this influence the dynamics? So just in the last year, we have found that if we implement all those details of cortical architecture, we have a potential solution to what psychologists have called the binding problem. Now, the binding problem is expressed by psychologists in different ways, but really it's about the fact that when you look at the world, you not only see features, but you see how all those features are related to each other. You see the spatial and semantic relationships between features. So one simple example that psychologists give is binding color to an object. Another simple example might be if you look at the letters T and L presented together, we see the horizontal and vertical bars comprising those letters, which would be represented at an early visual processing stage in cortex. And you also see the actual letters, the identity of the letters themselves, which would be at a later stage of processing. So then the question is, well, how do you bind the individual elements to the letters?
So just to be clear, today's networks that can recognize T's and L's or cats or whatever you're training them on are seeing those individual features, but they're not binding the features together.
So if you look on YouTube, you'll see a video from Google where they've trained a deep learning architecture on millions of images. And they were quite pleased when cells developed through learning that would respond to the presence of a cat in an image.
This is the famous Google discovers cats on the internet.
Exactly. So these cells would they self-organize and they would respond if there was a cat in an image. Now let's imagine that half the images contain cats and half don't. Then essentially those cells carry just one bit of information. Now when we look at a cat, we see the millions of features that make up that cat and how they relate to each other spatially and semantically. So that would be a very rich example of feature binding. And so theoreticians working in neuroscience have thought about feature binding. How is it implemented in the brain? And until recently, a lot of focus has been devoted to the idea of synchronization. So the idea here is rather simplistic, I feel. The idea is the visual system will segment a scene into a number of discrete objects, say several discrete objects. And then the neurons representing the features within an individual object would have their firing rates synchronized, or rather their actual spikes synchronized. But when you think about this from a psychological point of view, it doesn't make any sense at all. It doesn't correspond to the richness, the semantic richness of our own visual experience. Now, as I said earlier, in the brain, there are actually axonal transmission delays. It takes time for a signal to get from one neuron to the next. And when you implement these axonal transmission delays into a cortical model, it shifts the network from synchronized activity to polychronous activity. So what do I mean by polychronous activity? Well, what happens is that rather than neurons firing at the same time, you see chains of activity, temporal chains of activity, where you see a temporal pattern through time. And that introduces great complexity into the computation and potentially great increase in information processing capacity. But in addition, in our simulations, what we found is that it also generates a new class of neuron, which we've christened binding neurons, which represent the relationships between the features, represents the spatial and semantic relationships. And in fact, these kinds of neurons have already been found in neurophysiology studies in primates. So I give an example. In the first cortical stage of visual processing, primary visual cortex, also known as V1, in this area, traditionally, are found what are known as simple cells. And these are cells that respond to simple orientated bars in a particular locus in the visual field. Now, more recently, it's been found that a proportion of these cells are top-down modulated by local image context. And in fact, what they found is they've isolated a bunch of neurons which respond to vertical bars, and they found that a subset, maybe 15, 20%, are preferentially modulated if that vertical bar is on the left of an object, and a different subset if the vertical bar is on the right of an object. They've called these cells border ownership cells, and these would be classic examples of binding neurons that represent relationships between features.
So more broadly, you've basically got four mechanisms that are not present in today's deep learning networks that you think are present in the brain, and if we apply them to our current artificial neural network models, we can get them to perform better. So have you actually built those sorts of networks?
So if I just finish the point I was making, in terms of the, so we simulated the development of these border ownership cells, but the key point is that the mechanisms underpinning their development will operate across the visual cortex, across the visual field at every spatial scale. So it's a fundamental phenomenon which leads to almost infinitely rich information processing in terms of representing all the semantic relationships between features in an image. At the moment, to answer your next question, we're just tackling some rather simplified test cases, which might involve alphabetic letters or tables and chairs in a visual scene. So that's the stage we're at. In terms of actual application, obviously, this sort of architecture might be very useful for actually allowing computers to make sense of complex visual scenes, which could be very useful in visually guided robotics. Another area where psychologists think that binding plays a critical role is in grasping objects, because the brain has to be able, the visual system has to be able to represent all the features which make up an object and integrate them spatially in order to guide the movements of the hand. So it's early days for us. I would say that of course, I recognize there are lots of tasks that will always be better done by a traditional engineering approach and traditional machine learning approach. But at the same time, we think that understanding binding and actually how the cortex solves that problem is a critical step towards what we'll call general artificial intelligence or machine consciousness.
Well, let's talk about this two-way traffic because you've given several examples along the way there of how you can be informed by structures in the brain or mechanisms in the brain when you're building neural networks, but at the same time, you've proposed that things that have been found in the brain are examples of in other words, you're elucidating the mechanism of the brain at the same time. Has this sort of two-way traffic is definitely increasing lately, isn't it?
So my own background, my own PhD was in control systems engineering, so I have an engineering background, and I got involved in neuroscience because I just thought the brain has so much to teach us, and I think that's just obviously true. I felt so a lot of people express an interest, a lot of people working in machine learning express an interest in being guided by cortical architecture, but their models, I think partly because they're sort of focused on applications, their models really tend to deviate away from actually the detailed biological neurodynamics of cortical function, whereas my own lab is absolutely focused on that long-term issue. So it's very long-term research. is what we're doing. Nevertheless, I am actually, I think it's very useful for me to read the engineering literature because often engineers have thought about the same sort of tasks that the brain solves, so that can help to organize your own thinking about these problems. But one of the next steps we could think about doing is actually interfacing our cortical models with an existing deep learning or supervised error correction learning network, where the cortical model might pull out all the binding relationships in an image, which could then be processed by subsequent traditional engineering algorithms.
So going back to existing systems that claim to be inspired by the brain, I think a famous example would be AlphaGo, which Demis Hassabis starts off doing AI in video games, goes back to school, does a PhD in, systems neuroscience, and then says that things like AlphaGo are inspired, he says, not at the fine level, but at the macro level, by the brain, in the sense you have different modules doing different things. But that's a very different approach from what you're talking about. What's the difference?
There's a whole series of comments I can make to that. First of all, the brain is an example of what mathematicians call a complex system. And this is defined as a system of interacting elements whose behavior emerges from the lowest levels. And so I used to work in, as was pointed out, I used to work in computational aerodynamics. And if we wanted to solve the airflow around an aircraft, we'd have to solve out to like 100 wingspans to get the emergent dynamics of the system. And I think even more so with brain function. When it comes to, for example, you mentioned the Atari games that DeepMind developed. So I was listening to a professor of machine learning on the BBC World Service saying, well, the system, using all this really, I feel, quite inappropriate anthropomorphic language, you could say the system sees the screen. It doesn't see the screen. It's seeing is what you and I do, and we're still trying to figure out what that means. Secondly, the AlphaGo and the Atari software, they rely on model-free reinforcement learning. So what that means is they learn fixed mappings from states to actions without actually understanding the world they're in. Now, that's entirely different to brain function. Right back from the 1930s and 40s, the work of Edmund Tolman with rats showed that the brain builds a spatial and causal model of the world, and that's what endows it with its behavioral flexibility. So, for example, if you put a rat in a maze and you allow the rat to learn the maze, and you block a path, then it can take the next shortest route around it, and that's a sort of benefit of learning a causal and spatial model of the world.
But wouldn't the people who build those sorts of models say, they're trying to pursue a different approach to you? I mean, if you're trying to build a system that does something, is purity and how directly it correlates to the way the brain works what matters most? That's clearly what matters most to you. To other people who want to solve a problem.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. Yeah. I wouldn't discount from that at all. They solve the problem, and that's fantastic because we've been running our lab at Oxford without needing to solve binding for 20 years. We've made a lot of progress. So there are going to be lots of applications which do not require a solution to binding or to follow the principles of the brain. I wouldn't trust my own brain against a chess-playing program today. So I'm totally happy with that. And it's an open question as to what kinds of tasks are going to require something that is more representative of cortical function. And so we're exploring that. It's one of the questions we're asking.
But one of the things that AlphaGo does, and I'm sorry to bang on about it, but it is a sort of contrast to what you're doing, is it combines both biologically and non-biologically inspired systems. So it has two deep neural modules, and then it has this Monte Carlo tree search piece as well. And that's one of the reasons it's able to perform very well by actually deliberately using something non-biological. So again, if we cleave too much to the sort of purity of we want to build things that work like the brain, might we not be missing a few performance
I can only
tips?
go with my intuitions on this point. And my feeling is, so I've talked about model-free reinforcement learning. Now, and then I talked about the fact that the brain learns a causal model of the world and then it exploits this for behavior. My feeling is that the binding problem is going to be essential as an information representation basis for a model that then learns about causal relations in the world. In other words, if you want to build a model that learns causal relations, you need to solve the binding problem first so you can represent the world adequately in the first place.
So do you think that deep learning the kinds of approaches that are being pursued now that don't take binding into account, will run out of road and we'll have to go back and make those models more sophisticated?
I know that people at deep learning, what they're really interested in is general artificial intelligence and machine consciousness. That's what they're really interested in. And I think, and if that's the goal, then I think we have to pay very close attention to the cortex. The problem I have leading this laboratory at Oxford is it's very long-term research. So it's not jam today, and we're not thinking of in terms of applications. We're interested in fundamental neuroscience, and I think someone needs to be focused on that to make those long-term advances, and then eventually they will feed back into AI. And it's not clear yet where those advances will feed in, but I'm very happy to focus on the pure research.
And what's the nature of your, bearing that in mind, what is the nature of your interaction with the with the startup community and the engineering community? Is it that they read your papers, or are you talking to them directly about how they might apply your insights?
Well, last speaker and I are good friends at Oxford, and we talk to each other. And actually, one of my doctoral students, Dr. Irina Higgins, she finished her doctorate in my lab last year and took up a post at DeepMind. So I'm often down there chatting over exactly these issues.
Right.
And she's given a presentation on my lab's research at DeepMind. So in terms of the work on binding, up until recently, I mean, I think I could say this: DeepMind weren't into spiking neural networks. And I think just recently some people have arrived there with an interest, and so we're actually popping down next month to have a chat about these ideas. But it's still very much pure research at the moment.
Okay, so what I take away from all of this, however much you go into however much you follow the detail or not of what you're saying, is that we look at the systems we have now and go, wow, aren't they clever, aren't they fantastic, aren't they versatile? But this is a bit like sort of standing next to a 1950s mainframe and going, isn't it fast? And that we will come to see these systems as really quite crude, really quite quickly. Is that fair?
I think no. I think it's really horses for courses. You know, you want the right technique, and I think it's not clear yet. What I'm interested in is exactly the same thing that DeepMind is really interested in, which is the long-term prospect of general artificial intelligence. Just a philosophical dimension to that is absolutely extraordinary to solve that problem, and also. Our recent ideas about how the binding is solved tells us something about how the brain works, something very special, that it tells us how infinitely rich visual processing is. As I said, psychologists would talk about, when they're talking about binding, they talk about binding a color to an object. What we've discovered is this process gives rise to almost infinitely rich, semantically rich information processing, which underpins our consciousness. And we are absolutely at the beginning of this, because when you look at the visual system, there are very many different kinds of visual representation that we've been working on for years, modeling. For example, representations of object shape, facial expressions. Actually, I might just digress just slightly for a moment if I have time. You were talking about applications. Some of our recent work is looking at how the visual system learns to represent the spatial structure of faces, including facial expression. In the primate brain, you'll find different subpopulations of neurons encode either facial identity or expression, and that's rather curious, because when we see a face, we see both of these dimensions simultaneously. So somehow your brain pulls these pieces of information apart. And we published the first paper on this several years ago. We've developed things since then, and we've got a model which really in a very rich way describes how the brain processes the facial structure, the spatial structure of faces. And we've actually been able to apply this to tackling clinical depression. So clinical depression is a very serious illness. It's the most common form of mental illness. And it's associated with negative biases in information processing. So we tend to interpret events more negatively, recall more negative memories. In particular, we tend to depressed subjects tend to interpret facial expressions more negatively. And these negative cognitive biases are thought to reinforce the depressed mood state. And so using our simulations and our understanding of plasticity mechanisms, we've been able to design some specially constructed visual animations, which certainly in our computer simulations will rewire the connectivity, because your visual system is plastic all the time. So if we understand the mechanisms, we can construct these carefully designed animations which will rewire the connectivity to knock out these negative cognitive biases. So we can actually deliberately rewire the connections in your brain. And these, we've just submitted the paper on this, and our next step is we're working with clinical psychologists at Oxford, a whole bunch of them, to apply this to human test subjects.
So it's
next.
a therapy where you literally watch an animation and it.
Yeah.
There's a science fiction story in there, isn't there? I mean,
it's like Total
mind
Recall.
control through TV or something.
A little bit scary. And beyond this, we could look at memories, for example.
Right. I wanted to ask one more thing about the application of this and the binding problems. And you talked about the specific example of being able to pick up a glass, which I can do. There is this school of thought within AI that you can only really solve the AGI problem if you embody AI in the real world. If you have, do it through robots. When I talked to Demis Hassabis about this, he said the reason he doesn't do robots is that they're a nightmare. They go wrong all the time, and you spend your whole time fixing the robot and no time actually doing any research. So that's why he prefers to live in game worlds, which are much cleaner and don't go wrong. But do you think that actually putting AI out into embodied systems like that is going to be a crucial part of solving AGI?
So as I said, the brain is a complex dynamical system, but and when you're modeling the brain, there are really two halves to the coin. One half is the actual neural architecture and operation of the brain, but the other half is the sensory world. And it's the interaction of the two which actually gives rise to a mind and drives the self-organizational principles which produce a mind. So certainly embodiment is absolutely critical to general artificial intelligence as far as I'm concerned. And today we rely on these virtual reality simulations, just like the team at DeepMind. I am interested in robotics because they bring new challenges along with them, but they are problematic, and finding space is problematic. So certainly that's the way we're thinking there.
Okay, so you are expecting to go that way. Okay, well, we don't have very much time, so I thought I would give you the chance to ask any questions that you might have. So do we have any questions for Professor Stringer? We have a question over here. Please go ahead. We need a flying drone microphone. This is my idea for a startup, by the way, Nathan. So
Fascinating talk, Professor Stringer. Can you say a bit more about the timescales in which you expect that a comprehensive solution to the binding problem will be in place? Do you think this might take centuries, or is it decades away,
This is a really interesting question. So what we do is it's incremental, it's step by step. At the moment, we're looking at some simplified test cases just to get the basics of the dynamics. Frankly, what we can do depends on how much funding we have, to be quite candid, which is an issue because it's long-term research. But one thing we could hope to do over the next year, and have a student, it's quite a large lab, but have a young chap coming along next week, actually, who would actually like to do what I suggested, which was to interface this cortical model with a deep learning architecture and apply it to some machine vision problems. You talked about a complete solution. As I said, when you look at the visual system, there are many different areas, many different areas with cells which encode different kinds of information. Many different kinds of information. Neurophysiologists are still discovering these cells. We're right at the beginning. And I think in terms of real general artificial intelligence, well, okay, my approach would be to slowly scale up the system. So over the next 20 years, I'd like to build something on the level of a rat. And I know that DeepMind have exactly the same point of view. You gradually build up the system. So we start off with something that can just learn to make visual sense of the world and navigate and behave. And if I can achieve, because rats are conscious. They may not have the same level of consciousness or the same kind of consciousness, but I'm sure they embody the same basic underlying processing principles. So I'd be happy to, within the next 20 years, to get to something of the level of a rat. And rats are very clever animals anyway.
Do we have any more questions? We have a question over here.
Thanks. Hi, Tom. It's Alex Van Someren from Amadeus Capital. Professor Stringer, could you just say something about the computational cost of this work? In other words, do you get adequate performance out of the hardware that you're currently using? And is specialized hardware, I'm thinking like Steve Ferber's work at Manchester on Spinnaker.
That's right. So
is that important to you?
Yeah, we were working with Steve Ferber and we were trying out his Spinnaker systems. And so the young people in my lab who do all the work, we were using, for some time we were using sort of high-end Mac Pros, and then we started investigating the Spinnaker system. We got immediately an 8-fold speed up, but now the members of my lab are exploring high-end GPUs. And just last week, one of my PhDs said we've got a 2 orders of magnitude speed up with this system. So it's not bad.
I'm not surprised. Mac Pro hasn't been updated since December 2013, and Macs are slow anyway, so I can't believe you're trying to do this sort of stuff on Macs. I mean, that's, graphic design, sure. Yeah. Anyway, do we have any more questions? We have another question over here.
How much money do you need to make 20 years take 5 years?
Is your checkbook at the ready? Yes.
So that's a difficult one. Well, this is the point. It's rather difficult doing this. I've got great people in my lab. The reason I'm at Oxford is because of the young people there. They're a fantastic bunch, and I'm proud to work with them. But it's rather tough doing this on a series of graduate studentships. Each person's around for 3 years, and they spend the first 6 months to a year learning the game, and then they'll work for 18 months, and then they're writing up. And this isn't, I wish we had the deep pockets of DeepMind, really. It would make all the difference. You'd expect me to make this comment. It is frustrating because it's fundamental research, it's pure research, and it's not about jam today. And so it's really, whatever funding we can raise, it all goes into driving this forwards, basically. It is difficult today because the UK research councils now are just so oversubscribed and underfunded. We have to look for private funding, and so we organise dinners in the Queen's College in Oxford, and all sorts of amazing people come along, and hedge fund managers, and they fund us. So our lab is privately funded.
So invite him to dinner. And in fact, anyone else who'd like to go to dinner and fund this fantastic work, thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Simon Stringer.